here and we're going to get rolling. Awesome. Thank you for recording. So, you know, folks who signed up and maybe aren't going to make it, your friends and colleagues who, you know, something holiday related came up, no worries. We're going to be posting this for everyone later on. So yeah, also want to let everybody know that we've got colleagues in the room with us. We've got Sarah Earle, our Director of Communications, is here, and Kayla Preventure, who is our policy researcher. She's in the room too. So, hey, my friends, we're happy that you're here. All right, quick time check. We've got 2 minutes before we get rolling. So if anybody needs to grab a glass of water, I got to close that door behind me. We're going to get started real soon. And I think you can still register for this webinar. So if you're thinking, oh my gosh, so-and-so should really be here right now, shoot them that link to register. We'd love to have them join us. All right, I'm going to mute for 5 seconds and close that door. My office looks like Christmas just exploded in here. So I'm glad you can only see from here up. All right, it's 3:59. So I'm calling it, and folks can filter in as they need to. And again, we're going to share this presentation afterwards. I'm Sarah Robinson, the Senior Project Manager with Reaching Higher New Hampshire. Thank you all so much for being here. It's such a pleasure. And I have the distinct privilege of introducing Christina Pretorius, Reaching Higher's Director of Policy. She is the nerve center of our organization. So again, if you are watching Christina's presentation and you have questions you'd like to ask, please put them into the Q&A option or the chat. I will be monitoring and making sure that we see them by the end of the presentation. All right, Christina, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Sarah. It's really great to be here. And thank you everyone for coming today. And like Sarah said, we're recording this. So if there's something that you missed, or if you missed this presentation or whatever it is, it'll be up on our website probably by tomorrow. Today, we're going to be talking about House Bill 607, the local school voucher bill, and its financial impacts and some of the open questions that remain about the bill. But first, a little bit about Reaching Higher New Hampshire. We serve as a public policy resource for New Hampshire. All children deserve a high quality student-centered education, and Reaching Higher provides people the tools and the research they need to make informed decisions to deliver on that promise. And I am Christina Pretorius. I am the policy director here with Reaching Higher. So today, in today's presentation, we're going to go a little quickly through the presentation, so we have a lot of time at the end for questions. But we are looking at House Bill 607 as it was amended by the House Education Committee in November. This was a carryover bill. It was introduced January of 2021, had a public hearing in February, and was retained. House Ed took it up again in November, and it came out of that committee with an auto pass with as amended recommendation. So it will go to the full House floor. We're expecting it's on the docket for the first session, which begins January 5th. I think it's a 2-day session. So right off the bat, right opening of 2022 legislative session, it's one of the first bills that the full House will be taking up. So today we're going to look at an overview of the program, eligibility criteria, what can families use this money for, how is it funded, what are the roles of the scholarship organizations, of the school district, of families, and of the state. And then we're going to dive into a little bit of the bill itself. There are some contradictions. There may be some potential challenges for implementation based on some of the language of the bill and some of the open questions. And then, we'll have some time at the end for walking you through the next steps of the bill and the question and answers. So as a reminder, there is a Q&A box right at the bar there. Feel free to drop your questions in there, and Sarah and I will answer them, try to answer them all at the end. And if we don't get to any, we will post them on the website, or if you want to drop your email in, we can email back and forth. And my email will be on a slide at the end too. So feel free, if something comes up, reach out to me via email. We can set up a phone call. We can go back and forth with email. I'm happy to help in any way that we can for this and really all education related policy. So, let's dive right on in. So what is House Bill 607? So this bill would create a locally funded school voucher program that provides an average of about $10,000 per student for families to use for private school tuition, homeschooling expenses, and other education related costs. Just before we really dive in, you might hear people call these funds education savings accounts, education freedom accounts, EFAs, ESAs, a number of acronyms. But at the end of the day, no matter what people are calling them, they are school vouchers. School voucher is an umbrella term for using taxpayer funds for private uses. And so you will hear us refer to all of these education freedom accounts, education savings accounts, whatever it is, as school vouchers. So just going in, just wanted to make that really clear in case, because there are a lot of different terminology, but when we talk about vouchers, these are the things that people are talking about. So under HB 607, students, they receive that funding and they receive the funding and they don't go to their local school. So they take the money that's apportioned for local schools and they use it for private school tuition, homeschooling, whatever it is, other education related costs. And, if this sounds familiar, if this sounds like, hey, don't we already have something like this? We do already have something like this. New Hampshire in June passed a statewide school voucher program that funds these accounts with state funds for education. This program is different because it uses local funds, but there is a lot of overlap in the bill language. So we're going to dive into that a little bit more. So this is a separate and distinct program from the existing state school voucher in a lot of ways, not the least of which it's actually a separate chapter of state statute. The other one was RSA 194, I believe it's F, and then this is G. So they are completely different pieces. And the one that's in effect right now, the statewide school voucher program, provides parents with an average of about $4,600 per eligible student to use for a lot of the same reasons: public school tuition, homeschooling expenses, other education related costs. This 607 is creating a second school voucher program that's funded directly by local school districts. One thing that is, there is another thing to pass here, and it's if this bill passes and is signed into law, in order for a local school district to have a local school voucher program, 60% of voters would have to vote to approve it. And if that school district wants to rescind the program, voters would have to approve to rescind it as well by 60%. So the bill, whether the bill passes and is signed into law, there's still another step before schools can start setting up these school voucher programs and families can start enrolling in them. And that's that warrant article requirement. So this table is just really briefly comparing the two, the statewide school voucher program that was included in HB2, that the House budget bill back in June. It was HB 20 at the start, then it was SB 130. It had gone through a couple of iterations, but that statewide school voucher program, we're going to refer to that quite a bit in this presentation, but it's funded from the state's education trust fund, which is that piggy bank for state school funding. Students who participate in the statewide school voucher can't be attending a public school, including a charter school. So they have to disenroll from public and charter schools. Existing private and homeschool students are eligible for that statewide school voucher program, and it's an average of about $4,600 per student. That program began enrolling students in August of 2021, this past fall. The local school voucher program is a little bit different in that it is funded directly from local school district budgets. It's hyper local. Students remain enrolled in their local school district for purposes of school funding and special education services. And the way that the amended version is written, existing homeschool students are eligible, private school students are not eligible. So that is one difference, and yet another difference from the statewide school voucher program. In our calculation, the average was about $10,000 per student. So, you know, if a family has one student who opts in, that would be they would receive $10,000 in a voucher for education costs. If they have 5 children, they would receive $50,000, and that's per year that they are eligible and enroll in that program. And one thing, you know, I've been talking to a lot of different people, and one thing that was continually brought up is that, you know, lawmakers are still considering this bill. I've heard that there is some conversation, you know, school districts are starting to create their 2022 local district budgets, and that some people are saying, you know, should we be including this? And that is a local decision. However, I will say that lawmakers are still considering this bill. It's in the early phases. So that's certainly something to consider. And before it goes into implementation, districts have to pass that warrant article before they enroll students. So who is eligible for school vouchers? So a student must legally reside in the school district first and foremost. Then they have to meet one of 3 criteria. They either have to be enrolled in their public or charter school. They have to be a kindergarten student, or they have to be a homeschool student. Current private school students, the way that the amended laws is proposed, are not eligible unless they are in kindergarten, because that was one of the eligibility requirements. And when a student moves out of the school district, they're no longer eligible for that local school district voucher program. So I live in Deerfield. If Deerfield adopted it and my child was enrolled in the local school voucher program and we moved to Candia, that is a different district, and we would no longer be eligible. So just a quick table of looking at it visually. Currently homeschooled are eligible. Currently enrolled in a charter school eligible. Private school not eligible unless they're in kindergarten. There is very specific language in the proposed version of the bill where students cannot receive both an education tax credit scholarship and a local school voucher. If they have to choose one or the other, the education tax credit scholarship, just as a reminder for some, is a scholarship program funded through education tax credits, as the name implies, and it provides about $2,700, if I remember off the top of my head correctly, about $2,700 per student per year that families can use for private school tuition, homeschool expenses, a lot of the same purposes. Students who have, families who have incomes of over 300% of the federal poverty guideline are also eligible. So one of the big differences between the state school voucher program and the local school voucher program is that there's no income requirement for this local school voucher program as it is currently written. So it's a family income of $20,000, you qualify. Family income of $2 million a year, you qualify. There's no eligibility requirements in the current version of the bill that was amended in November. Kindergartners eligible, and students who right now receive the state school voucher program, a lot of people are saying they are ineligible, but as we will see on the next slide, it is actually a pretty big question of whether or not they are actually eligible. So one question that continually comes up is, can a student take both the state school voucher program and the local school voucher program? Can they get both? Can they get both that state funding and the local funding? And there's a lot of talk around this. It is very ambiguous. So there's nothing in the actual bill, the HB 607 as amended, that says you cannot take both a state and local EFA school voucher program. However, local school vouchers, if a student enrolls in a local school voucher program, they are still counted in their as enrolled in their public school district for purposes of school funding and for purposes of special education. And if you look at the statute for the state school voucher program, students who are enrolled in their resident district public school are not eligible for the state education freedom account or school voucher. So that has been one interpretation of that is a student who takes a local school voucher is considered still enrolled in their public school district. So they wouldn't be able to apply for the state EFA. However, there is a little bit of confusion because if you look at both bills, they have identical disqualification language. So in both the adopted version of the state voucher program and the proposed language of the local school voucher program, it says enrolling as a full-time student in the resident district public school shall result in the immediate suspension of the payment of the EFA. So there is a little bit of ambiguity around there. It's an open question. I've heard a bunch of different interpretations, a bunch of different takes, which this is coming out of committee. This is going to the full House floor, and it's one of the bigger open questions. And these kinds of open questions can be really challenging in this phase of a bill. And so it's something that we will certainly be keeping an eye on. And if there is, if there's a lawmaker in the audience that has some more clarity on that, please drop it into the chat or happy to have a conversation with you. But our understanding and what we're hearing right now is that there is quite a bit of ambiguity around, can students take both a local and a state school voucher? And so moving on to, how are they calculated? And before we get into the formula, I will say that there is a lot of some more ambiguity around interpreting how to calculate these school vouchers. And the statute, the proposed language of the bill says that each superintendent must calculate the amount of their local school voucher. So there's no real role for the Department of Ed to play to provide guidance or anything like that. I went through the exercise of calculating each school district amount, and I will be really forward in saying that there isn't a whole lot of clarity in exactly how to calculate. There are quite a few assumptions that one may have to make in interpreting this. So that's just something else to consider, as we move forward with this bill. And so generally speaking, the vouchers are calculated by taking 80% of the amount raised by local taxes, less local special ed spending, and then dividing that by the average daily membership in attendance. And that is how you come out with the local school voucher. It's a pretty complicated formula. On our website, we have a couple of tables that help break it down district by district on what that amount will be. And the next slide, we break into it a little bit more. But it's a pretty complicated. It looks more straightforward than it is in real life. I'll be very honest. And so when we look at what are the actual amounts per district, there are 15 school districts who don't have any ADMA, so they theoretically wouldn't have the option to have a local school district, local school voucher program. But of those that do, the lowest is about $291 per student per year. The highest is $40,562 per student per year, with the average being about $10,000. So a really wide variation for a number of reasons that we can start diving into in the next slide. So I'll just get right onto it. So we are right here comparing three different districts, District A, B, and C. And so looking at these different districts, they are very different. So District A, very small, 134 students in their local district public schools. This district sends, they operate a small elementary school, and then they send for high school and the other grades. They send to a neighboring district, which is common of a lot of our smaller school districts in New Hampshire. District B, 411 students there. They also send for high school. They send out to a neighboring district, but 411 students attend their public schools that they operate within their district. And then District C is a little bit larger, about 1,800 students, and they operate K through 12, not in one school building, but their district operates K through 12. So they have pretty wide ranges in terms of the local district revenue, but we can see that play out in the local school voucher amount, where District A, their local school district, their local school voucher would be about $25,000 per student per year. District B would be about $16,000 per student per year, and District C would be about $5,500 per student per year. So we see pretty wide variations in the local school voucher amount. And this is due to a number of different reasons. That total local district revenue is the amount that they raise in their local, from their local school tax. That's reported on the DOE 25. So that does not take into account state funding. It does not take into account federal funding, Title I, all of those other title programs. It doesn't take into account state adequacy or differentiated aid, or stabilization grants, which we see play out quite a bit. But one of the other big pieces that it doesn't include is SWEPT, that statewide education property tax. This is strictly from local property taxes. And so we see that lever sort of move up and down district to district, depending on all of those types of things. The local spending on special education, that was an assumption that Reaching Higher made in our calculations. So that was total local spending as reported on the DOE 25, minus state and federal special education funding. So state funding being differentiated aid, and the state special education aid, which is formerly known as catastrophic aid, as well as that federal IDEA special education funding. So those were some of the assumptions that we made in trying to be really consistent with the intent of the law as it was proposed. So that's sort of how it plays out, and we can see a really wide range in this local school voucher amounts. And I know that that's super. It's a pretty complicated formula, and our website, we have two tables in particular, one that breaks down the entire calculation, and then one that breaks down just the local spending on special education, so you can see, how much what we did to get to that local spend. So I'm happy to go through a little more. If there are questions, please drop them in and we can revisit this after. So moving on, one thing to know about the local school voucher amount is that the first year that the student is enrolled, that really sets what is called the floor. So their local school vouchers are recalculated every year based on previous year's taxation and spending. Eligible students can't receive a school voucher that's less than that first year's participation. So if the first year it was $15,000, the next year something happened, the school funding formula or something else happened, and that number dropped down to $10,000 per student, that student would get $15,000 for instead of that $10,000. So it sets that minimum. And if repealed, the district has to continue paying for all participating students. So the law includes language where a district can repeal the local school voucher program. So, say 1 year, they say, let's try this out. They vote it in and 10 students participate that first year. The following year, they say, this really isn't working out for our community. We don't want to offer this anymore. And voters agree and they rescind the program, they repeal the program. The district is still responsible for paying the school vouchers for those 10 students for the remainder that they remain eligible for the program. So if it's a kindergartner, if there are 10 kindergartners, the district is responsible for paying until they graduate, as long as they don't move out of the school district. They have to continue funding all of the participating students' accounts for as long as they remain eligible. And one other piece here is not only do they have to continue funding the school voucher? But the way that the proposal is written, they will also likely also have to pay for special education services for those students if they continue participating in the school voucher program. And I've talked to a number of colleagues, and student needs change quite a bit as they progress through their academic career, and school districts would be responsible for paying for those services for the entirety that the student is eligible for the voucher. So how are they funded? They are funded entirely from local school district budgets. They are calculated based on local school district budgets, and they are paid for from local school district budgets. And one thing to note is that it does directly divert funding away from public school students. One of the most obvious ways are for districts with tax or spending caps. So if a community has they can only spend $5 million per year, and it's adjusted annually or whatever it is, they have to pay both that local school voucher and pay for their existing public school students out of that, from that cap that's directly taken from the spend that's available for local public school students. There is an open question regarding differentiated aid. So local school districts receive differentiated aid, which is additional targeted funding for students navigating poverty who qualify for free and reduced lunch. They receive differentiated aid for students who receive special education services. They receive targeted funding for students in English language learner programs. And those are based on a number of check-ins with the students. So free and reduced lunch applications are how that is, how that's calculated. But there's an open question of, if a student takes a local school voucher, who is responsible for figuring out, what differentiated aid does that student qualify for, and how is that communicated? So does the scholarship organization who manages the school voucher program, are they responsible for determining eligibility for differentiated aid? Is it still on the school district? It's an open question right now. There's no real guidance in the current version of the bill, but it could have really big impacts for local school district budgets. If a number of students qualify for free reduced lunch, enroll in the school voucher program, and they lose that differentiated aid, that could mean that could have a pretty big impact on their school district budget. The local school voucher program could also increase local education taxes. So this table has an example. So if a local school voucher is $10,000 per student per year, and the district is receiving $3,700 per student in state funding, that local school district has to make up $6,300 per student. And that's through budget cuts, it's through local property tax increases, it's through a mix of both. But either way, that local school district has to make up that difference. They will still receive state funding for that student, but depending on that local school voucher amount, they will have to make up that difference. And the impact to the state budget. This is an interesting piece of the bill. So homeschool students are eligible for local school vouchers. And right now, as current law is, if you have a homeschooling student who's not enrolled in the statewide school voucher program, you just have a homeschooling student in your school district. They do not, the school district does not receive state funding for that homeschooling student, unless they take a course at the school or something. But for this example, they don't. They are homeschooled, so the school district does not receive funding for them. But with the local state school voucher program, that homeschooling student enrolls in the local school voucher program. They're counted in the average daily membership and attendance, and the district starts receiving state adequacy dollars for that homeschooling student. that means that the state is now paying for that student where they weren't before. So, there were 4,000 homeschooling students this year, and assuming all of them enroll in a local school voucher program, that's a $15 million impact per year to the state budget. So we would not expect it to be that high, but there are no caps or anything like that. So that's just, if if every district adopted this, every single homeschooling student enrolled, that would be about $15 million impact to the state budget. So, moving on to the responsibilities of school districts, when a student adopts a local school voucher, the school district is still responsible for providing services, special education services for qualifying students. So this 194G7 for its special education services, that just sort of says, what responsibilities the school district has. And the bill sponsor has said, we've seen some language that this is similar to the charter school statutes where a student goes to a charter school and the local school district is still responsible for paying, for providing and paying for special education services. But if you look at the charter school statutes, there are safeguards, there's guidance, and there's some more detail around the duties and responsibilities of local school districts, of charter schools, and of families. And even that, we've heard that there's a lot of concern around that relationship with charter schools, local districts, and special education services. So even that process is imperfect. And in fact, there are about 10 bills that we're expecting in 2022 that tinker with that process. And so to have this sort of modeled after that, it might be problematic. And, even the current version of HB 607, it lacks a lot of detail and it could be open to interpretation to a process that is already highly complex and very complicated. So there are a lot of open questions around special education services, the responsibilities of the school district, of whatever education service provider the family goes to, for the family, for the scholarship organization. So this is one of the big pieces of the bill that have a lot of open questions, and we'll be watching it really closely. So on to approved uses. There are a number of uses. Families can use the school voucher money for private school tuition, for course fees, textbooks, for curriculum, transportation, online learning, for testing fees. But one important piece here is that there are more restrictions than the state school voucher program. And it's assumed that the scholarship organization will be the scholarship organization that administers the local school voucher program will be the same that administers the state school voucher program. And with a lack of transparency and the lack of accountability and the differences in the approved uses, in process, and all of those kinds of things, it could lead to confusion and potential misuse of funds, whether intentional or unintentional. But it is one piece that, in reading through the bill, we've heard some concerns about, these programs are close enough that they might be confused, but are separate enough where there are some real differences in how they can be used when all of these kinds of things. So not having the accountability and the transparency there could pose quite a bit of problems and may lead to a misuse of funds. So, speaking of the scholarship organization and oversight, the scholarship organization does have the same definitions as the state school voucher program, and they have nearly identical responsibilities and administrative duties. So the third-party scholarship organization is responsible for the approval and denial of student applications, of education service providers, and it can, the bill states that it can approve education service providers on its own initiative. They're responsible for the administration of the program, for monitoring for fraud and misuse, for determining how much they retain as a fee, up to 10%. And the bill is clear that the scholarship organization may collect gifts, grants, and donations in order to administer the program. And notably, they do not include any conflict of interest provisions. So this scholarship organization is responsible for the approval and denial of education service providers. And at the same time, it's also responsible for monitoring for fraud and misuse, and has no conflict of interest provisions, which in other states we've seen that the conflict of interest pieces are pretty challenging, and so to not have any is one red flag. The scholarship organization has very little public oversight of taxpayer funds, and the nearly identical language. There were many concerns raised by not only the Legislative Oversight Committee, but also of the general public, of the lack of oversight, of the delegation of authority. And so to have nearly identical language could raise a lot of questions with the public, but that's something else to watch out for. So, when looking at the bill itself, we've heard a lot of people say, is it ready for, quote, prime time? Is it ready to go to the House floor? Is it ready to go to the Senate? Is it ready to be signed? And is it ready to be implemented? And we had a lot of open questions around the bill. There were a number of contradictions of language. So there were a couple of instances where it would say one thing, and then a couple of lines down, it would say something else. And so it was a little bit confusing there. There are open questions regarding the actual calculation. We heard in the public hearing for this in February, a business administrator said that, he sat down and tried to do it and found it was very confusing. And there were a lot of questions. And so those types of things with the actual implementation could prove to be really challenging. But some of the other questions that we had, are school districts allowed to adopt a cap on either the number of local school vouchers that they provide or the amount of funding approved? Or do all districts have to fund all eligible students who apply? That is not addressed in the bill in any clear and consistent way. So districts may be open to a lot of liability in terms of, if half of their students leave, can they implement a cap or no? Can they phase in the program or phase out the program? Or do school districts have any latitude in determining how many and how much they can spend for this type of program? One of the other open questions is, what's the role of the local school district and the New Hampshire Department of Education in the actual administration of the program? In reading through the bill text, it appears as though the scholarship organization has the bulk of the authority in the management and administration of the program, despite its use of local taxpayer funds. And so there are a number of open questions, particularly in referencing appeals. That was one of the places where the Department of Ed was cited, but it didn't give a lot of details. And appeals, when they matter, they matter. If a parent wants to appeal, it needs to be clear, what are the steps they have to go through, who do they have to go through, and things like that. So confusion in that area is challenging. What are the requirements for auditing individual student accounts? The proposed law has a number of references. They have contradictory requirements. So, it states that the scholarship organization has to conduct random audits on an annual basis. And then later on, in a couple of lines down, it says it has to conduct an annual audit of all accounts. So that's one example of, contradictory requirements. What's happening there, what what's the real requirement? Another question is, so students who enroll in the local school voucher program, they do have accountability requirements, so they can do a number of things every year for academic accountability. They can take the statewide assessment. They can submit an academic portfolio that has a list of, this is what they did this year, or they can take another standardized test like the SAT, the ACT. There's a number of them in other states and that kind of thing, so they can take that kind of test. But if a student adopts a local school voucher and takes the statewide assessment as part of that accountability requirement, one of the questions that we had is, are those assessment results included in district-wide assessment reporting? So if I look at, say, Goffstown, and 10% of their students have a local school voucher, if I look at their assessment report for Goffstown, does that include the students who took the state voucher, the local school voucher, or do they not? Are they reported separately? So that's a question that we had. And then, one of the other questions that we had that I had mentioned earlier is, will districts still be required to collect information for differentiated aid, for free reduced lunch, for students who have English language learner programs, for special education? Who collects that information? Well, is it the scholarship organization? Is it the school district? Who does it? When and how often? And just like, what's the process for that? Because it does have pretty substantial impact on state funding. So, looking through, does the public want school vouchers? This is something that comes up all the time. And in a lot of polling, New Hampshire is opposed to school vouchers. March 2021 Granite State poll, which is a quarterly public opinion poll that's statewide, 45% of people opposed school vouchers. In April, 61% of people opposed school vouchers. In HB 607 public hearing specifically, 650 people opposed it and 35 people supported it. So we can see that opposition to this is really lopsided. So which is certainly something to consider going forward. And a couple of the things that people have said in the public hearing, somebody testified saying, we should be focusing on fair and equitable funding for all students, which is something that we hear quite a bit, between last year and this year. The lawmakers have implemented a $25 million cut in school funding over the next biennium. So there are problems there. We hear a lot, why are lawmakers focusing on things like school vouchers and privatization when we should be talking about fair and equitable funding for our public schools? And so that was a major theme of the public hearing. A school business administrator talked about the complications in reading through and figuring out, how do I actually apply this? What does this formula actually mean? How can I calculate it? And so there's a lot of concerns around transparency, around actually implementing the program. And so there was quite a bit of testimony. And then finally, what does the research say about school vouchers? Nationally, school vouchers have been shown to really hurt student outcomes. We've read this before, we've said this before, we have these sources on our resources on our website, but really the general consensus among the research community is that the push for vouchers really is, they quote, distracting from the implementation of other programs that do improve student learning, like teacher training, like improve student health and nutrition programs, like high standards and curriculum. In other states, students who participate in school vouchers had significantly lower math and reading gains on state tests than public school students. So really the research shows that if we want to improve student outcomes, we need to be concentrating on our public schools and providing each student with access to a high quality public education. So looking at the next steps for the program, the original version of the bill, it already had its public hearing in February. The House Education Committee retained it and then sent it out of committee with an ought to pass with amendment recommendation. That was a 10-9 vote, 10 for ought to pass, 9 for to kill it. And then the House is set to vote on the bill during its opening session, which begins on January 5th. And so, if passed, we would expect the bill to go to the House Finance Committee. I didn't see a fiscal note on the bill, but we would expect there to be an impact to the state budget. We would expect it to go to the House Finance Committee. It may not, but that would be what we would expect. And then it has to go to the Senate before it's passed. So it still has a bit of a road ahead of it. But the biggest date to remember is January 5th. And with that, we can open it up to some questions.
Boy, oh boy, do we have some questions.
Okay, good.
I mean, when it comes to issues like school vouchers, conversations like this can bring up a lot of emotions, can bring up a lot of questions, a lot of confusion, especially as Christina mentioned, the way that this bill is written, there's a lot of contradictions. So we will do our best in the next 15 minutes to answer as many questions as possible. Like I said, we run a tight ship, so we want to get you out of here on time. Any of the questions that we are not able to answer or that you may potentially come up with after the fact, please don't hesitate to reach out to Christina directly. You can see her email on this slide. So enough of my talking. I'm going to be asking these questions in chronological order, and I'm going to focus on the Q&A because it is where all of the questions are pretty much. There are a few in the chat, and if we have time, I'll go back through there. But if you've accidentally put your question in the chat, please throw it into the Q&A. I'm trying to manage two at the same time. So really appreciate your patience. Okay, so our first question is hoping to get a sense of how many Republican reps are definitely opposed to 607, which is a fair question. Would you mind answering that, Christina?
I can only answer it by saying I don't know. Reaching higher, we don't do any lobbying, we don't do any direct advocacy, and so I'm not contacting representatives and saying, you need to vote this way or this way. So I don't know for sure, but you can contact your own state rep and see sort of where do they land on the spectrum.
Thank you very much. So we have another, all of these questions are really great. It's clear that we have folks in the audience who really understand public education, which is awesome. So someone heard that the current bill language did not include provisions for city municipalities who do not vote via town meeting. Can we address this?
Yeah, so there was a big there's a pretty sizable section at the end of the bill regarding that, and I would agree with that. There is some confusion around that last piece of the bill. I would follow up with the New Hampshire Municipal Association regarding the or the New Hampshire School Boards Association regarding, the voting aspect of it and SB2 towns versus, cities and those kinds of things, those types of elections. So I'm not an expert on voting law. And so I would refer an official answer. I would probably refer you to the municipal association.
That's great.
But I can follow up with them and get that out to the group for sure.
Thank you. That's very kind. So there's a lot of questions involving eligibility, which totally understandable considering this is the second attempt at voucher program in the state. So someone asked for clarification. So right now a homeschool student can attend a class in a public school
Mhm.
And the public school funds will pay any tuition if a sending district pays tuition. So how would HB 607 differ from that statement?
That's a good question. And that is another ambiguity that is in the bill. So if we look at the bill text, one of the allowable uses is tuition and course fees at any public school or chartered school. But then it also references existing state law that says that students participating, that like homeschool students can participate in curricular and co-curricular activities, courses, programs, and so forth. And so that is another open question, because homeschooling, as you said, homeschooling students can, take courses at their local school, tuition free, like they don't, the parents have to pay. So that's another
whole lot of ambiguities. So, we apologize if your questions can't get answered because they're just not written into the legislation. So here's an interesting question. What would stop a private school student enrolling this spring or summer in public school and then transferring back to private school in order to have access to these dollars?
That's a great question. And it is yet another open question, because the statute says that an eligible student has to be currently attending a New Hampshire public school. It doesn't say for how long. So in other states, there are requirements where a student has to attend a public school for 100 days or a minimum of 1 full school year or something like that. There are no qualifiers for how long a student has to be enrolled in a public school or a charter school in order to be eligible. So I guess the short answer is, in essence, nothing as it's currently written.
Mm-hmm. Another question about, public school, is, can HB 607 funds be used to tuition to another public school outside of the residence district?
Yes, that is a qualifying educational expense, tuition at any public school. So that would be an allowable expense.
We have a lot of questions around the special education funding and students' eligibility for special education. So this question, it's a long one. So under the local vouchers program, special needs students are still eligible for special services, apparently. Does this sound like a parent could apply for the local voucher, but still expect the student to go to the school daily for special services? And if so, how many hours per day or per week might be spent in the school with the family still receiving that funding for additional homeschooling?
That is a really good question and a really good point. There's nothing in the current version of the bill that I've seen that directly addresses that. There is a line in the bill that states that special education services can be delivered at the discretion of the school district. So whatever works for the school district. But there isn't anything, if a student is there for, say, more than half of the school day receiving services, does that mean that they don't qualify? There's no language that prevents that. So that is something that, and I'm not a special education expert. That's highly technical and highly complicated laws and language and rules and all of those kinds of things. But I did not see in the current version of the amended bill anything that regarding, restrictions on IEPs, restrictions on services and things like that.
Thank you. So this isn't so much a question as it is it is kind of a question. It's a concern about this House bill wreaking havoc on schools with area agreements that legally assures sending districts send their students to a receiving district. It's worded in an interesting way. So it's sort of, it was phrased, won't this wreak havoc on schools with sending agreements? Sorry, I needed to clarify that a little bit.
And I think that that's one of the really big points when it comes to the ambiguity. So that's another layer of consequence when they talk about resident district public schools. That is, you know, a family can't enroll their student in their resident district public school is the exact phrase. But what about a tuition agreement? What about an area agreement? Things like that. That is unclear. So there could be, you know, a lot of questions around, well, how does it affect area agreements? How does it affect, you know, CTE agreements, things like that. So that's an open question, one that I don't have an answer to, and may have to be worked out on the House floor, in the Senate, whatever the next step of the bill is.
Thank you. So let me see. Someone would like you to comment on this statement that the scholarship organization gets 10% of the funds to administer this program. This would suggest that the organization sort of has an interest in participation in the program. Would you mind commenting on that?
Yeah, that is one of the concerns that has been brought up at public hearings for both the state school voucher program that's in effect and the local school voucher program. I will say that we've seen the scholarship organization be active in some efforts regarding the bill. There was a website regarding the state school voucher program that lobbied for the bill, for the passage of the bill, and that scholarship organization was named on that website. And so there, you know, that has been a concern among the public of, you know, what is that conflict of interest? Where is that boundary?
Mm-hmm. There's a question as to whether this legislation were to have been derived from a group like ALEC. And for the folks who aren't familiar, ALEC stands for the American Legislative Exchange Council. They develop legislation for legislators. They're a national organization. Is that something you can comment on?
I haven't seen, so, you know, this is something that as a policy resource center that we track, you know, we look at legislation. Is it taking hold nationally? Is this happening in other states? Does it seem to come from, you know, a central source? This bill in particular, I have not seen it anywhere else where it talks about the local school district funds. I haven't seen it in other states yet. And I haven't seen it on any other central organizations. So I can't speak to it, but I'm happy to do some more research to see.
Thanks. I'm just doing a quick time check. We've got 4 minutes left. So thank you everyone for your patience. This is all good information. There's a question about curriculum requirements that students participating in the program must follow. Mm-hmm. Are there participation curriculum requirements?
Yes. So when a parent guardian opts into the program and signs that agreement with the scholarship organization, they have to sign to acknowledge that they swear to provide a curriculum in math, in reading, in writing, US and New Hampshire Constitution, in history, appreciation for art and music, all of the big areas. But there is something, there is no, the only accountability for that are those 3 options. So in the front end, you know, the parent or guardian signs and says, I promise to do this. And then at the end of the school year, they either have to the student has to take the statewide assessment, submit the portfolio, or take another standardized assessment as an accountability metric.
Thanks. How does the voucher bill appear on the ballot in a municipality, and when would that ballot be voted on?
Yeah, so there is very specific wording in the bill. So it says exactly what has to be on the ballot. And the exact wording is, quote, shall we adopt the provisions of RSA 194G to allow the establishment if a local education freedom account program in your local school district. So it's very specific on the wording of the question. There is quite a bit of language regarding timing. So, they have to collect 25 signatures or 2% of the registered voters, 10, the fifth Tuesday of the, so it copies the RSA and some of the other warrant article statutes that are out there. But there is very specific wording, and there are specific deadlines that people have to meet in order to put it on the warrant article. I will say, however, that I've heard quite a few questions on whether or not that warrant article, the timeline that's specified in this proposed language, would meet requirements for deliberative sessions for town meetings. So, with the way that a calendar shakes out, would voters be able to deliberate this question at a deliberative session, depending on how many Tuesdays is the fifth Tuesday? When does that fall on the calendar? Will voters have the time to sort of deliberate that? That's been an open question, and one that I haven't been able to dig enough into, but it's certainly one that I'm interested in further.
Okay, we're at 4:59, so we can't possibly, there were still a handful of really great questions. And as said before, please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly. Also a plug for the New Hampshire Education Network. You'll be talking to me if that's what you hope to do with us. We are a group of people who are interested in public education. We like learning about it and sharing about it and talking about it. This is a great slide to help you understand, what our priorities are for the network. So please feel free to utilize this bit.ly link and join us. Our next meeting is coming up quickly, and you will get all of that information as you join. So thanks for throwing that on. And do you find this helpful? We love doing this work. It is, it's what we show up every day loving this and loving New Hampshire and wanting this to be a great place to live and raise families and build businesses, and just, we want New Hampshire to be the best that it can be. If you found this helpful, we would really appreciate your support in making sure that we can continue to provide webinars like this so that folks can remain educated about legislation. Our pride and joy is taking complicated stuff and making it understandable. So any amount helps. We're really grateful for your consideration. Christina, any final thoughts?
No, thank you all for being here. And again, if you like this type of style webinar, whatever it is, drop it in the chat, because we're starting to plan for 2022 legislative session. And if this is helpful, we would love to know it so that we can do it more.
Awesome. Thanks again, everyone. It's 5:01 and we're working, moms. So,
as I said,
my kid's somewhere. Wishing you all a gentle holiday season. May it be restorative. May you all find peace and enjoy the ones that you love during this time of year. So we'll see you all in 2022. Bye, everyone.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.